Hey guys, today we're going to talk about methods of factoring part 2, brought to you by Miss B. Okay, here we go. Okay, time for the I can statements. You should be able to factor polynomial expressions applying the various methods of factoring we've been talking about. Okay, now we're going to hit some new methods of factoring. One is called grouping. And Miss Bennett likes to call this, I like to put a re on that grouping because you'll notice how we regroup. We do it, and we'll talk about that in a second. Another is called the quad form, and then we have the sum and difference of cubes. Okay, with that being said, let's talk about what grouping is. And again, I like to put a re on that grouping. So regrouping is a factor method most used when you have 4 terms. And those terms have a G, C, F. Okay, that's indicator that you want to do regrouping. Okay, guys, the steps to regrouping is to find the GCF. The next step is to drop in parentheses. So all this stuff just means parentheses. The next step is to find a GCF again. And then the last step, and this is the last step, I like to call this is the reason why I call it regrouping, because you're going to regroup the terms. Okay, so you're going to rearrange or regroup the terms. All right, let's try this. Let's put it into practice. Okay, so first let's look at when we recognize when we have to regroup. What you're looking for is a polynomial with 4 terms. When you see 4 terms, that's when you want to regroup. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do though, whenever I'm looking at 4 terms, I want to see if I can take a GCF. I notice I cannot. Okay, so I'm going to try this method of regrouping. So I'm going to first drop in my parentheses. I'm going to put parentheses around the first 2 terms. And I'm going to put parentheses on the last 2 terms. I'm going to include the sign. Okay, I got to make sure I include the sign, and you'll see why in a second. Now I'm going to look and see if I can find a GCF again. But this time when I look for a GCF, I'm only going to look for a GCF between the first 2 terms. And if I look, I know that there is a GCF with x. Okay, they both have terms x, so I can take out a x squared. If I take out a x squared, I'm left with a x plus 6. Then I'm going to look at this second group, and I'm just going to look for a GCF between the second group. I notice that I can take out, I got a -5 and a -30. I'm going to take out the negative, right? So I'm going to take out a negative and the 5 because that's the GCF. The 5 is the GCF, but I'm going to take that negative in front. So if I take out a -5, then what I'm left with is a x plus 6. Here's where you're going to do the regrouping. Because if you look here, this is a term and this is a term. And you got to see, what do these terms have in common? This is when you're going to take out another GCF. You're not going to regroup. You're taking out another GCF. You're going to look and see, what do those 2 terms have in common? So notice that what the 2 terms have in common is a x plus 6. So when I take, that's going to be my GCF. I'm going to take that x plus 6 out to the front. And when I do that, when I take out a GCF, these two go away, right? Because I pulled that out of those terms. And so I'm just left with a x squared and a minus 5. Okay, so there's regrouping. I have factored it. There's no plus or minus in between. This is factored it completely. There's regrouping at its best. Let's go to the next one. So I notice I have 4 terms. I'm going to look to see if I have a GCF between all 4 terms. I notice I do not. Okay, so there's no GCF between all 4 terms. But then I'm going to go to step 2 and I'm going to drop my parentheses in. Okay, and I'm going to just group the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. When I drop my parentheses in, I'm going to look for a GCF for my first set. So I'm looking at this first set and I notice there is a GCF between here. I can pull out a 2 and I can pull out a x squared. So what does that leave in the parentheses? Well, if I pull out a 2 and an x squared, then that means that I would be left with a 6x plus 1. So now I'm going to go to the next set and see if I can find a GCF. And I notice I can find a GCF. Okay, so between these 2 sets, I can take out a negative 5, right? Negative 5 is a GCF. So I'm going to pull out that negative 5. And I would then be left with a 6x plus 1. And I think at this point you guys can see when you know you did grouping right? Because if you grouped correctly, that means that you're going to end up with 2 terms, right? So I got 1 term here and 1 term here. And what's going to happen is both the terms are going to have the same factor in it. So notice this first term has a 6x plus 1, and this second term has a 6x plus 1. That's how I know I did it right. I can go ahead and do a GCF again. I'm going to pull out that common factor, which is 6x plus 1. And those go away. And then I'm going to regroup. I got a 2x squared. And I got a minus 5. Okay, so that's going to go in my next set. 2x squared minus 5. I have factored this pair. All right, let's go to the last one. So first you always want to look. I got 4 terms, but I want to see if I have a GCF between those terms. I'm looking and it looks like there is no GCF, but since I have my 4 terms, I'm going to go ahead and drop my parentheses in, and I'm going to go ahead and group those terms. Now, since this middle term, or I should say the term right here, this x is positive, I don't need to drop parentheses around the sign in the front, okay, because it is already positive. But when it's negative, like the problem we did before, we definitely want to make sure we group that negative in, okay? We want to group the negative in. All right, we're going to look at the first group, and we're going to see if we can find a GCF. So I'm looking at this first group, and I can't find a GCF. I can take out an 8x squared. And what would that leave me with? If I take out an 8x squared, I'm left with an x minus 8, right? Over here, I notice I have a x minus 8 already, okay? No GCF. But I'm good. Look, guys, I'm good to do another GCF because here's my first term and here's my second term. And both terms have a common factor. They have the x minus 8, right? So I can go ahead and pull out an x minus 8 of both terms. now we just got to think about what we're left with when we do that. So for the first term, it's pretty obvious. Okay, if I pull out an x minus 8 for the first term, I'm left with that 8x plus, or 8x squared. So I got that. And then I got to think. When I pull out the x minus 8, or when I divide by x minus 8, if I divide x minus 8 by x minus 8, what am I left with? Well, what you're left with when you pull that out or factor that out is a 1. Because we're dividing here. Same over same is 1. So this would be a plus 1. All right, guys, let's go to the next one where we talk about the quad form. Okay, guys, the next form is called the quad form. Basically, the quad form is going to be just like factoring trinomials, except we're going to be using a polynomial to the 4th power instead of the 2nd power. But we're going to take the same steps as if we were factoring a trinomial to the 2nd power using product sum. Okay, so when you see this quad form, it's to the 4th power, the 2nd power, and then you have a constant term. You're going to think of product sum. Okay, so you're going to do the same thing you would for product sum, which is you're going to create your two factors, x and x, right? We know they're both going to start with the x. And I'm going to look at these coefficients. I'm going to think of two numbers that multiply to 14, but add to a negative 9. Now, because it's a negative 9, I know both of these numbers have to be negative to multiply to this positive 14. And yet we're thinking 2 and 7. They multiply to a positive 14, but they add to a negative 9. Now all I got to do is make sure I get this quad form correctly. Okay, so if it was just a trinomial whose leading coefficient was, whose degree was 2, we would be done. But because the degree is 4, we just have to play with our x's here. Instead of x's, they're going to be x squared. Both of these will be x squared. So now if I multiply this out, I would end up with the 4x squared, or with the x to the 4th power minus 7x squared minus 2x squared, which would give me that minus 9 plus 14. So all you're doing, you're going to do the same thing as product sum, except instead of x's in your factors, you're going to have x squared. Let's look at the next one. And before we do anything, if I look, I notice with this one, the coefficients have a GCF of 2. So let's go ahead and factor that 2 out. Okay, so we'll factor the 2 out, and I would be left with x to the 4th minus 2x minus 8. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to think of two numbers that multiply to a negative 8 and add to a negative 2. Now, I know if they're multiplying to a negative number, I know that my two numbers, one has to be positive, the other one has to be negative, right? And we know we got x and x, but this time it's going to be x squared. So my two numbers multiply to a negative 8 and add to a 2, or add to a negative 2. The only two numbers that I can think of is positive 2 and negative 4, right? Positive 2 and negative 4. Those are going to multiply to a negative 8, but add to a negative 2. All right, let's look at the last one. The last one, we got this leading coefficient here, but notice we do not have a GCF. So this is going to be our bottoms up factoring. We got to get rid of that leading coefficient first. Now, remember I taught you guys that I like the bottoms up way Okay, that's what Miss Bennett likes to do. And then I like to do product sum.